The morning sun blazed intensely over the massive dam construction site in Burkina Faso. The air resonated with the thunderous sounds of hammers striking metal, heavy machinery grinding against earth, and the voices of workers shouting instructions to each other as they labored tirelessly to complete the ambitious new hydroelectric project that would bring electricity to thousands of homes across the region. President Ibrahim Traoré had decided to make an unannounced visit to the construction site. As a leader who believed in seeing progress firsthand rather than relying solely on reports from his ministers, he wanted to witness personally how the work was advancing on this crucial infrastructure project that would transform the lives of countless Burkinabe families. The dam represented more than just concrete and steel. It symbolized hope, progress, and his vision for a self-reliant Burkina Faso. When its presidential convoy came to a halt near the construction site, workers immediately rushed to form an orderly line, greeting their president with a mixture of respect, nervousness, and genuine admiration. Some had dirt-stained clothes and calloused hands that spoke of honest labor, while others wore the crisp uniforms of supervisors and engineers. President Traoré, dressed simply in his military uniform without the usual ceremonial decorations, walked with the confident stride of a man who had risen from humble beginnings to lead his nation. This was not a leader who enjoyed standing at a distance and waving ceremoniously. Ibrahim Traoré was known throughout Africa as a hands-on president who insisted on seeing everything up close, understanding the real challenges his people faced, and making decisions based on ground-level realities rather than sanitized briefings in air-conditioned offices. As he toured the massive construction site, observing the intricate network of concrete foundations, steel reinforcements, and the complex system of channels that would soon harness the power of rushing water, something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Not far from where a group of burly men were lifting heavy sacks of sand and cement, he glimpsed a small silhouette, much smaller than any of the adult workers around. At first, President Traoré assumed it was simply a child who had wandered onto the site to play near the water, perhaps the son of one of the workers who had brought his family to see the impressive construction project. Children were naturally curious about such massive undertakings, and it wouldn't be unusual for a worker's child to explore the area during a break. But as he looked more carefully, his heart suddenly stopped. The small figure was indeed a boy, but he couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The child's tiny hands were completely covered in dust and grime. His clothes were not just dirty but torn in several places, and there were streaks of sweat and dirt across his innocent face. The child was struggling desperately to lift a basin filled with sand, his small body swaying dangerously under the weight that was clearly far too much for someone of his size and age. Despite the obvious difficulty, the boy was forcing himself to continue, taking small, unsteady steps as he tried to carry his burden to wherever it needed to go. President Traoré's expression immediately changed from curious observation to deep concern. He quickened his pace, walking briskly toward the child. His security guards, trained to anticipate his movements and maintain proper protocol, started to follow, but he raised his hand firmly, signaling them to maintain their distance while he approached the situation personally. Bending down to the child's eye level, President Traoré spoke in the gentle, fatherly tone he reserved for the most tender moments. "My son, what are you doing here? Why are you carrying sand? You are too young for this kind of work." The boy looked up at him with large, innocent eyes that held a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and something that looked disturbingly like resignation, as if heavy labor was simply an accepted part of his young life. He didn't respond immediately, instead, lowering his head in silence, perhaps unsure whether he was in trouble or uncertain how to explain his presence to this important-looking man in uniform. President Traoré, still hoping that perhaps the child was simply playing or helping, in some minor way, turned to one of the construction supervisors who was standing nearby, watching the interaction with obvious discomfort. The supervisor, a middle-aged man with weathered hands and sun-darkened skin, was shifting nervously from foot to foot and seemed to be avoiding direct eye contact with both the president and the child. "Who is this boy?" President Traoré asked, directly. "Why is he here on this construction site?" The supervisor moved even more uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could be anywhere else at that moment. He glanced around as if hoping someone else might answer the question, but finding no escape from the president's direct gaze, he finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. President," he began hesitantly, "this boy, he comes here every single day. His name is Adama. He works here for a small daily wage. We have told him to go home several times, but he refuses to leave. He insists that he needs the money because his mother is very sick and cannot work." The words hit President Ibrahim Traoré like a physical blow. His eyes widened in shock and disbelief as the full implications of what he was hearing began to sink in. The bustling construction site, the impressive machinery, the ambitious national project, everything seemed to fade into the background as he focused entirely on this devastating revelation. "What?" His voice rose, echoing across the construction site with an authority that immediately commanded the attention of every worker within hearing distance. "A 6-year-old child is working here? And you have been allowing this to happen?" The construction workers froze in place, their heads bowed in shame and fear. The sound of machinery seemed to quiet, as if even the mechanical sounds recognized the gravity of the moment. Some workers who had been several hundred meters away began moving closer, sensing that something significant was happening but not yet understanding the full scope of the situation. President Traoré turned back to little Adama, his voice now trembling with a mixture of compassion and barely controlled anger at the adults who had failed this child. "Tell me, little one, why are you here? Where is your father?" Adama's lips began to tremble as he finally found the courage to speak. His voice was small and fragile, but his words carried the weight of tragedy that no child should ever have. "To bear. My father went away," he said, his voice breaking. "He died last year. My mother is very, very sick. She cannot work anymore because she coughs all the time and can barely walk. I come here to carry sand because the men give me a little bit of money. I use that money to buy medicine for my mother and food for both of us." The child paused, wiping his nose with the back of his dusty hand before continuing with heartbreaking determination. "I also try to save some money so that maybe one day I can go back to school. I had to stop going when Papa died because we couldn't pay for my books and uniform anymore." Upon hearing these words, President Ibrahim Traoré felt something fundamental break inside his chest. The massive dam construction project, the sophisticated machinery, the hundreds of adult workers, the entire ambitious infrastructure development, all of it suddenly seemed to disappear from his awareness. All he could see was this small boy, barely old enough to tie his own shoes, carrying a burden that was crushing not just his tiny shoulders, but his entire childhood. The president's throat tightened with emotion, and for the first time in front of his security detail, his cabinet, members, and the construction crew, his eyes filled with tears. These were not the calculated tears of a politician seeking to make a point, but the genuine anguish of a leader who had just witnessed the failure of his society to protect its most vulnerable members. He turned abruptly toward the construction, contractors and site supervisors, his voice fierce with righteous anger, yet breaking with the depth of his emotional response. "Shame on all of you," he shouted, his words carrying across the entire construction site. "You call yourselves men, and yet you allow a 6-year-old boy to work here? Instead of helping him, instead of protecting him, you have been profiting from his suffering and desperation." His voice grew stronger, filled with the authority of his office and the moral weight of his convictions. "Did you think I would never discover this? Did you believe that you could exploit a child's poverty while building a project meant to improve our nation's future? The contractors and supervisors stood frozen in place, their faces pale with the realization that their actions, or rather their inaction, had been exposed at the highest level of government. Some stared at the ground, others glanced nervously at each other, but none dared to speak or offer excuses for what was clearly inexcusable. President Traoré's chest rose and fell with the intensity of his anger and heartbreak. "Effective immediately, all of you are suspended from this project," he declared with finality. "You are not worthy of the trust that has been placed in you. A child should be in school, learning and playing and dreaming of his future, not laboring in the dust, carrying sand that weighs more than he does." The workers bowed their heads even lower, but Ibrahim Traoré was no longer concerned with their embarrassment or fear. His entire attention had shifted back to Adama, whose small frame was now trembling as tears streamed down his dirt-stained cheeks. Without hesitation, without concern for presidential protocol or the dust that would stain his uniform, President Traoré bent down, gently lifted the boy into his arms, and held him close against his chest. The child's tears immediately soaked into his military uniform, and Ibrahim Traoré, the strong leader known throughout Africa for his courage and determination, could no longer hold back his own tears. "Don't cry, Adama," he whispered softly into the boy's ear. "From this day forward, your entire life is going to change. I promise you that your suffering ends today." The construction workers and supervisors watched in stunned silence as President Ibrahim Traoré carried young Adama in his arms toward the waiting presidential convoy. The boy clung tightly to the president's chest, still sobbing, but now with a different quality to his tears. These seemed to contain not just pain, but also the first glimmer of hope he had felt in a very long time. The contractors whispered among themselves, but no one dared to speak loudly. They all understood the profound significance of what they were witnessing. This was not merely a political moment or a publicity opportunity. This was a genuine human connection that would have far-reaching consequences for the entire nation as the presidential convoy began its slow journey back toward the city. President Traoré sat in the back of his official car with Adama on his lap. He gently wiped the boy's face with a clean handkerchief, trying to comfort him while also learning more about his devastating circumstances. "Adama," he said softly, his voice filled with genuine paternal warmth. "You will never have to carry sand again. I give you my word as your president and as someone who cares about you. Now tell me, where is your mother right now?" The boy sniffled and wiped his nose before answering in his small, fragile voice. "She is at home, but she cannot walk very well anymore. She coughs so much that sometimes she cannot breathe properly. I try to buy medicine when I have enough money, but it's never enough to make her completely better. She cries at night when she thinks I'm sleeping, but I hear her." President Traoré closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the full weight of this family's suffering. Here was a child who should have been concerned with playground games, school lessons, and childhood friendships, but instead was carrying the overwhelming responsibility of being the sole provider for his desperately ill mother. "Don't worry anymore, my son," the president said with firm determination. "Today we will go to see your mother together. But first we need to get you some proper clothes. You cannot meet her looking like this, covered in dust and wearing torn clothing. Today marks the beginning of your new life." The presidential convoy made an unexpected stop at a small marketplace in Ouagadougou. When President Traoré stepped out of his official vehicle carrying young Adama, the reaction from the local people was immediate and dramatic. Vendors stopped their activities mid-sentence. Customers turned to stare in amazement, and a crowd quickly began to gather as word spread that their president was walking among them. People stepped aside respectfully, many bowing as they murmured prayers and expressions of surprise at seeing their leader in such an intimate, personal setting. This was not a scheduled political rally or an official state visit. This was their president acting as a caring father figure to a child in need. They entered a modest clothing store owned by an elderly woman named Madame Salimata, who had been selling fabrics and garments in the same location for over 20 years. When she realized who was standing in her small shop, she nearly fainted from shock and overwhelming honor. "Mr. President!" she exclaimed, dropping the colorful fabrics she had been arranging. Her hands trembled as she tried to straighten her headscarf and compose herself in the presence of such an important visitor. President Traoré smiled warmly, his demeanor completely different from the stern, angry man who had confronted the construction supervisors just hours earlier. "Today, I am not here as your president," he said gently. "I am here as a father who wants to help his son. Please, show us some nice clothes for this boy." Adama's eyes widened with wonder as he looked around at the rows of clean, colorful shirts, neatly pressed pants, and shiny new shoes. He had never seen so many clothing options in one place, and certainly had never imagined that any of them might be meant for him. President Traoré knelt down beside the boy, bringing himself to Adama's eye level. "Choose whatever you like, Adama. Today is your special day, and you deserve to have clothes that make you feel proud and happy." The boy hesitated at first, overwhelmed by the choices, and perhaps still unable to believe that this was really happening to him. But encouraged by President Traoré's gentle nodding and reassuring smile, he slowly began to explore the options available to him. Eventually, Adama pointed to a bright yellow shirt that seemed to glow with sunshine and optimism, and a pair of crisp blue pants that looked like they had never been worn. He also shyly indicated a small pair of sneakers that were exactly his size. "Excellent choice," President Traoré said proudly, his eyes still glistening with tears that now seemed to be tears of joy rather than sorrow. "These colors suit you perfectly. Now go try them on." When Adama emerged from the small changing room wearing his new outfit, the people in the store began to applaud softly. The transformation was remarkable. This was no longer the dusty, exhausted child laborer from the construction site, but a bright, handsome boy whose natural intelligence and dignity shone through his clean appearance. The boy looked at himself in the mirror, hardly able to believe that the reflection staring back at him was really himself. He had never owned clothing that fit so well or looked so new and beautiful. "You look like a prince," President Traoré said with genuine pride and affection. "And from this day forward, that is exactly what you are, a prince of Burkina Faso who will have every opportunity to achieve great things." The presidential convoy continued its journey, with young Adama now dressed in his new clothes and directing them toward the small neighborhood on the outskirts of the city where he lived with his mother. As they traveled through the streets, the contrast between the clean, modern vehicles of the presidential entourage and the modest surroundings became increasingly apparent. The houses in Adama's neighborhood were constructed from mud bricks and topped with rusted corrugated metal roofing. Children played barefoot in the dusty streets, and women sold vegetables from small bowls positioned along the roadside. This was not the desperate poverty of complete destitution, but rather the challenging circumstances of families working hard to survive on very limited resources. Finally, the convoy stopped in front of a particularly small house with a wooden door that had clearly seen better days. The paint was peeling, and one of the hinges appeared to be loose. Adama tugged gently on President Traoré's sleeve and said simply, "This is where we live." The president followed the boy through the doorway into the modest interior. The room was dimly lit and carried the slightly musty smell of dampness that suggested ongoing problems with the roof during rainy seasons. The furnishings were minimal, a few cooking pots, some worn cushions, and little else. On a thin mattress in the corner of the room lay a frail woman who was coughing weakly but persistently. When she looked up and saw her son entering while holding the hand of the president of Burkina Faso, her eyes widened with shock and confusion. "Adama!" she cried out, struggling to sit up despite her obvious weakness. "What is this? What have you done?" Why is the president here? Please don't worry, madam, President Traoré said gently as he moved closer to her makeshift bed. I am here to help your family. There is nothing to fear. The woman's name was Awa, and although she was only in her early 30s, the hardships of recent years had aged her face considerably beyond her actual years. She looked back and forth between the president and her son, who was now practically glowing in his new clothes, and tears began to fill her tired eyes. My boy works too hard, she murmured, her voice barely audible. I have told him many times not to go to that construction site, but he never listens to me. He says he must take care of me because there is no one else. President Traoré knelt beside her bed with the same gentle respect he had shown when speaking to her son. You are a strong woman, Awa, he said with sincere admiration. You have raised a son who has a heart bigger than this entire world. But from this day forward, you will not suffer alone anymore. We are going to take you to the hospital where you will receive proper medical care. You need treatment, and you will have access to the best care available. Awa completely broke down at these words, covering her face with her hands as tears of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming emotion poured out of her. God has answered my prayers, she whispered through her tears. Without wasting any time, President Traoré immediately ordered his medical team to bring a proper stretcher to transport Awa safely and comfortably. His security guards, who were typically known for their stoic, impassive demeanor, moved with unusual tenderness as they carefully helped lift the weakened woman onto the stretcher. Adama walked closely beside the stretcher during the short journey to the vehicle, holding his mother's hand firmly and refusing to let go. He seemed afraid that if he released her hand, she might somehow disappear, or that this miraculous turn of events might prove to be just a dream. At the municipal hospital, the medical staff immediately sprang into action when they realized that the president himself had brought a patient who required urgent care. Awa was quickly admitted to a private room where she could receive immediate and comprehensive medical attention. As President Traoré stood at the foot of her hospital bed, watching her finally rest peacefully for the first time in months, he made a silent vow to himself and to this family that had already endured far more hardship than anyone should face. This family would never again know hunger, desperation, or abandonment. He placed his hand gently on Adama's shoulder and spoke with the solemnity of a sacred promise. From this day forward, you are also my son, and your mother is my sister. I will never abandon you or forget about your needs. Adama looked up at him, his eyes bright with gratitude and wonder, and for the first time since this extraordinary day had begun, he whispered softly, Thank you, Papa Ibrahim. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady, reassuring sound of the oxygen machine that was helping Awa breathe more easily than she had in many months. She was resting peacefully, her breathing no longer the labored, painful struggle. It had been for so long. Adama sat beside her bed, holding her hand and refusing to let go even for a moment. President Ibrahim Traoré stood near the window, looking at the boy with a heart that was heavy with sorrow for what this family had endured, but also full of determination to ensure that their future would be completely different from their past. For years, the president had received official reports about children who were forced to work instead of attending school, children who begged in the streets, and young people who carried burdens that were far too heavy for their small bodies to handle. But encountering one of these children face to face, hearing his personal story, and witnessing his courage had pierced his soul in a way that no written report could ever accomplish. He turned to one of his most trusted assistants, Captain Seydou, a loyal officer who had been with him since the early days of his political career. Seydou, President Traoré said with firm authority, this child must return to school immediately. Prepare all the necessary paperwork right away. I want Adama enrolled in the best school in Ouagadougou with full scholarship support for everything he needs. Yes, Mr. President, Captain Seydou replied with a crisp salute. understanding the critical importance of this directive. Later that evening, President Traoré sat with Adama outside the hospital under the evening sky. The boy was quiet, looking up at the stars that were just beginning to appear as daylight faded. "Adama," President Traoré began gently, "do you enjoy school?" The boy nodded enthusiastically. "I love school very much, but I had to stop going because we didn't have money for my uniform, books, or school fees. I keep my old books in a box under my bed. Sometimes I read them at night by candlelight when I can't sleep." The president smiled warmly at this evidence of the boy's natural love of learning and his determination to educate himself even under the most difficult circumstances. "From now on, you won't just be reading at night by candlelight. You will be studying every day in a proper classroom with good teachers and all the books you need. I am going to give you a full scholarship that covers all your school fees, your uniform, your books, and everything else you need to learn and become a great man." Adama's eyes widened with amazement and joy. "Really? You mean I can go back to school?" "Yes, my son," President Traoré replied with absolute conviction. "You will study hard, and someday you will help build an even better Burkina Faso for future generations." The boy suddenly jumped forward and wrapped his small arms around the president in a tight hug. Tears flowed down Ibrahim Traoré's cheeks once again, but this time they were tears of pure joy and hope for the future. 3 days later, after Awa had regained enough strength to leave the hospital, President Traoré invited the family to join his convoy once more. Adama held his mother's hand firmly, uncertain about their destination, but filled with excitement and anticipation about what new surprise might be waiting for them. The cars stopped in a quiet neighborhood filled with newly constructed houses that were simple but solid, painted white with bright red roofs. Children played outside, their laughter echoing through the air and creating an atmosphere of hope and community. This was clearly a place where families could build stable, secure lives. President Traoré guided them toward one of the houses, stopping in front of a modest but well-built home with a small garden area in front. "This is your new home," he said quietly, watching their faces for their reactions. Awa stopped walking entirely, staring at the house with complete disbelief. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, President," Traoré said, placing his hand gently on her shoulder, "that you and Adama will never again live in darkness, dampness, and fear. This house belongs to you now, completely free of charge. Here you will sleep peacefully. Here you will recover your health. Here your son will grow up with dignity and opportunities." Adama ran ahead into the house, his eyes sparkling with wonder, as he explored each room. There was a small living room, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with modern appliances, and even a bathroom with running water, luxuries that had seemed impossible just days before. He jumped on one of the beds, laughing with pure joy and amazement. For the first time in his young life, he had his own bedroom, his own space where he could keep his books and clothes and dream about his future. Unable to believe that this was really happening to them, Awa fell to her knees in the living room, covering her face as tears of gratitude poured out. "May Allah bless you, Ibrahim Traoré," she prayed aloud. "May He protect you always for your kindness and generosity." The president knelt beside her and gently helped her to her feet. "Please, don't thank me," he said humbly. "Thank your son. His courage and determination led us all to this moment today." 1 week later, President Traoré convened a national press conference that would be broadcast throughout Burkina Faso and across West Africa. The large conference hall was packed with journalists, government ministers, international observers, and ordinary citizens who were eager to hear what their leader had to say. The story of the boy at the dam had already spread like wildfire throughout the country and beyond. Social media posts, newspaper articles, and radio broadcasts had carried the account of President Traoré's emotional encounter with young Adama to every corner of the nation and to African communities around the world. When President Traoré entered the conference room, the entire hall fell silent. He walked directly to the podium with the confident bearing of a leader who was about to make an announcement that would change the course of his nation's history. His voice was firm but filled with deep emotion as he began to speak. "Brothers and sisters of Burkina Faso," he said. "Several days ago, I visited a construction site at our new hydroelectric dam. There, I encountered a boy who was only 6 years old, working under the blazing sun, carrying sand to earn money to feed his sick mother. This child should have been in school. He should have been playing with friends, learning from teachers, and dreaming about his future. But instead, poverty and desperation had forced him into child labor." The crowd murmured with sympathy and anger, many people wiping tears from their eyes as they thought about their own children and grandchildren. "I tell you today," President Traoré continued, his voice rising with passionate conviction, "that no child in Burkina Faso will ever again be abandoned to such circumstances." He paused to let his words sink in before continuing with even greater intensity. "From this moment forward, if any boy or girl is found working on construction sites, selling goods in the streets, or carrying burdens that are too heavy for their small shoulders, report it immediately to my office. We will remove them from these situations, provide them with education, and support their families so that economic desperation never again forces children into labor." The applause that followed was thunderous, with camera flashes illuminating the room and journalists frantically taking notes to capture every word of this historic declaration. But President Traoré was not finished. "I have suspended the contractors who allowed this crime against childhood to occur, and I will not hesitate to suspend anyone, minister, governor, or business owner, who dares to exploit our children. Burkina Faso must protect its future, and our future is our children." At that moment, young Adama, wearing his bright yellow shirt and looking clean, healthy, and dignified, was brought onto the stage. The boy looked shyly at the large crowd as he stood beside the president, still somewhat overwhelmed by all the attention, but clearly proud to be there. President Traoré placed a protective hand on Adama's shoulder and said, "This is Adama. He is not just my son now. He is the son of Burkina Faso, and I promise you there are thousands of children like him whom we must save, protect, and give opportunities to succeed." The hall erupted in sustained applause and cheering. Journalists wrote furiously, broadcasting this message of hope and social justice throughout the nation and beyond. In that moment, a wave of hope and determination spread across Burkina Faso like a grass fire of positive change. The days following the press conference were unlike anything Burkina Faso had experienced in recent memory. Throughout villages, towns, and cities, people talked constantly about Adama, the boy from the dam whose story had become a symbol of struggle, hope, and the compassion of a leader who chose to take concrete action rather than simply making empty promises. In their new home, Awa and Adama began living the kind of life they had only dared to dream about in their most optimistic moments. For the first time in years, their meals were regular and nutritious. For the first time, they slept without fearing that their roof might collapse during the rainy season. For the first time, Adama woke up each morning knowing that his only responsibility was to go to school and learn. One morning, a government official arrived at their house carrying a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter signed personally by President Traoré. The letter read, "Dear Adama and Awa, as long as I live, you are not alone in this world. You will receive a monthly allowance from the state treasury to ensure that food, medicine, and comfort are never beyond your reach. This is not charity. This is your right as citizens of Burkina Faso. May this assistance help you live with dignity and hope for the future." Attached to the letter was documentation of a monthly financial allowance that was more than sufficient to cover all their basic needs without any worry or stress. Awa collapsed in tears once again, holding the official document against her chest. "Allah is truly great," she whispered through her tears of gratitude. When Adama wore his new school uniform for the first time, he stood in front of the mirror in their new home, smiling with a mixture of pride and excitement. The uniform was perfectly clean and well-fitted, with shoes that had been polished until they gleamed. He clutched his new school bag tightly, unable to hide his enthusiasm about returning to his education. "Mother," he promised solemnly, "I will study harder than any student has ever studied. I will make President Traoré proud of his decision to help us, and someday I will help other children who are in the same situation I was in." At school, the teachers welcomed him warmly, and his classmates whispered about him with curiosity and admiration. Everyone knew that he was the boy who had made the president cry, the child whose story had touched the heart of the entire nation. Meanwhile, President Ibrahim Traoré was working closely with the national parliament to create comprehensive new legislation. The Child Protection and Education Act was passed with overwhelming support, completely banning child labor in all its forms and establishing rapid response intervention teams to rescue children from dangerous or exploitative work situations. The new law included the creation of an emergency hotline where any citizen could report cases of child labor, abuse, or exploitation. Teams of social workers, police officers, and medical personnel were deployed throughout the country to ensure that children found selling water bottles at traffic lights, shining shoes for pennies, or carrying heavy loads in markets would be immediately removed from these situations and provided with education, medical care, and family support. The Burkina people quickly realized that these were not just empty political promises, but concrete actions backed by government resources and presidential commitment. Slowly but steadily, the streets began to change. Children who had once begged at traffic intersections were now walking to school with backpacks and books. Mothers who had once wept over empty cooking pots were now receiving government allowances that enabled them to feed their families with dignity. Despite his extremely busy schedule running the country, President Traoré made time to visit Adama regularly. Sometimes he brought new books, sometimes educational toys, and sometimes he simply came to sit and listen to the boy's stories about school, his friends, and his dreams for the future. The president had become not just a political leader to this family, but a genuine father figure who took personal interest in Adama's development and well-being. One afternoon, as they sat together under a large mango tree near the new house, Adama asked a question that had been troubling him. "Mr. President, why did you cry when you saw me that day at the construction site?" President Traoré looked at the boy thoughtfully, for a long moment before responding with complete honesty. "Because when I saw you, I saw myself when I was young. I also faced many difficulties and hardships when I was growing up. But Allah sent people into my life who guided me, supported me, and gave me strength to overcome my challenges. When I saw you that day, I knew that Allah had sent you to remind me of my duty as a leader and as a human being." Adama's eyes filled with tears, but these were tears of gratitude and understanding. "Then I promise you that I will never disappoint you or waste the opportunities you have given me." Months passed, and the impact of that single encounter between a president and a child laborer continued to grow and expand throughout Burkina Faso and beyond. Newspapers across Africa wrote feature articles about the boy who changed Burkina Faso. Musicians composed songs in local languages celebrating both Adama's courage and President Traoré's compassion. Children throughout the country began to believe once again that their futures were not limited to poverty, exploitation, and suffering. At school events and community gatherings, people frequently asked Adama to speak about his experience and his transformation. His words were simple but incredibly powerful. "I was a boy who carried sand and worried about my mother's illness every day. Now I carry books and dream about becoming a doctor so I can help other sick people. If my life can change so completely, then every child's life can change too. If our president believes in us and invests in our education, then we must believe in ourselves and work hard to justify that faith." These speeches were always met with thunderous applause and standing ovations. Adama became a symbol of hope, not only in Burkina Faso but throughout West Africa and beyond. Word of President Traoré's compassionate leadership and Adama's remarkable transformation began spreading far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. International news organizations picked up the story, broadcasting it to millions of viewers across Europe, America, and Asia. The narrative of a president who literally lifted a child laborer from poverty and transformed not just one life but an entire nation's approach to child welfare resonated with people worldwide. The African Union invited President Traoré to speak at their annual summit about his child protection initiatives. Standing before presidents and prime ministers from across the continent, he spoke passionately about the moral imperative of protecting children. "Fellow leaders," he declared, "we measure the strength of our nations not by the size of our armies or the wealth of our natural resources, but by how we treat our most vulnerable citizens. Every child forced into labor is a failure of our leadership. Every child denied education is a theft of our continent's future." The speech received a prolonged standing ovation, and within months, several other African nations had implemented similar child protection programs modeled on Burkina Faso's success. Back home, the transformation continued. The monthly reports that crossed President Traoré's desk showed remarkable progress. School enrollment had increased by 40%, reported cases of child labor had dropped by 70%, and family poverty rates were declining steadily thanks to the expanded social support programs. But perhaps most importantly, there was a change in the national spirit. Parents who had once felt hopeless about their children's futures now spoke confidently about their sons and daughters becoming doctors, teachers, engineers, and leaders. Children who had once worked in dangerous conditions now competed eagerly in mathematics competitions and science fairs. 2 years after his rescue from the construction site, Adama had become one of the top students in his grade. His teachers marveled at his dedication, his natural intelligence, and his remarkable ability to help other struggling students. Despite his own traumatic past, he showed extraordinary empathy and patience when working with classmates who faced learning difficulties. Adama is not just academically gifted, his principal, Madame Ouedraogo, told President Traoré during one of his regular school visits. He has become a natural leader among the children. When new students arrive who have been rescued from difficult situations, he immediately befriends them and helps them adjust to school life. The boys' favorite subjects were mathematics and science, but he also excelled in literature and social studies. His teachers noted that he approached every assignment with the same careful determination he had once applied to carrying sand. But now that determination was channeled toward building knowledge instead of simply surviving. During a school science fair, Adama presented a project about water purification systems that could be built in rural villages. His presentation was so impressive that it caught the attention of university professors who were serving as judges. "This boy has the mind of an engineer," one professor told President Traoré. "With proper nurturing and continued education, he could make significant contributions to our country's development." The president smiled proudly. "Then we must ensure he has every opportunity to develop that potential." The success of Adama's transformation and the broader child protection program had created a ripple effect throughout Burkinabe society. Successful business people began establishing scholarship funds for rescued children. Teachers volunteered their time to provide extra tutoring for students who had missed years of schooling while working. Communities organized support networks to identify and assist families before economic desperation forced children into labor. Awa, Adama's mother, had made a complete recovery from her illness thanks to the consistent medical care she had received. But more than that, she had become an advocate and counselor for other mothers facing similar challenges. She regularly spoke at community meetings, sharing her story and encouraging other families to seek help rather than allowing their children to work. "I know the shame of watching your child carry burdens that should be yours to bear," she would tell audiences of struggling parents. "But I also know the joy of seeing that same child graduate at the top of his class. There is help available, but you must be brave enough to ask for it." Her words carried special weight because everyone knew she had lived through the worst circumstances and emerged not just surviving, but thriving. The government had established Adama centers in major cities, resource centers where families could access financial assistance, job training, medical care, and educational support. These centers were named after the boy whose story had sparked the national transformation, and they served thousands of families each month. Of course, the transformation was not without challenges. Some business owners initially resisted the strict enforcement of child labor laws, arguing that it would hurt their profits. A few corrupt officials tried to exploit the new social programs for personal gain. There were bureaucratic delays and implementation difficulties in remote rural areas. But President Traoré's response to these challenges was swift and decisive. Business licenses were revoked for companies that continued to exploit children. Corrupt officials were prosecuted and imprisoned. Additional resources were allocated to ensure that even the most remote villages had access to the protection and support programs. "We will not allow greed or corruption to steal the futures of our children," he declared during a nationally televised address. "Every child in Burkina Faso deserves the same opportunity that Adama received, and we will move mountains if necessary to ensure they get it." The international community took notice of these efforts as well. The United Nations recognized Burkina Faso's child protection program as a model for other developing nations. International donors provided additional funding to expand the programs even further. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the children themselves. In schools across the country, students wrote letters to President Traoré, sharing their own stories of rescue and transformation. These letters, thousands of them, filled several filing cabinets in the presidential office, and President Traoré made it a point to read each one personally. As Adama entered his fourth year of renewed education, he had grown not just academically, but also as a young leader and advocate. Now 10 years old, he was frequently invited to speak at international conferences about child rights and educational access. His poise and articulate speaking ability amazed audiences who remembered that just a few years earlier he had been a silent, struggling child laborer. During one particularly memorable speech at a UNESCO conference in Paris, Adama addressed an audience of education ministers from around the world. "Honorable ministers and distinguished guests," he began, his voice clear and confident. "I stand before you not as a victim, but as proof of what is possible when leaders choose compassion over indifference. 4 years ago, I could barely read because I was too busy trying to survive. Today, I dream of becoming a doctor so I can heal others the way my president and my country healed me." The audience gave him a 5-minute standing ovation, and several ministers approached him afterward to learn more about Burkina Faso's successful programs. Back home, Adama had become a mentor to newly rescued children. He understood better than anyone the fear, shame, and hopelessness they felt, and he could speak to them in ways that adult counselors sometimes could not. "I know you're scared," he would tell frightened children who had just been removed from exploitative situations. "I know you feel like this is too good to be true. I felt the same way. But look at me now. I have a real home. I go to school every day, and I'm learning things that will help me build a better future. You can have All of this, too. His gentle guidance and living example gave hope to children who had almost given up on the possibility of a different life. President Traoré's vision extended far beyond just rescuing children from immediate danger. He understood that sustainable change required building systems and institutions that would continue protecting children long after his presidency ended. The government established the National Institute for Child Welfare, a permanent institution with dedicated funding and trained staff to monitor child protection nationwide. They created partnerships with universities to train social workers, teachers, and child psychologists specifically focused on helping rescued children succeed academically and emotionally. A national curriculum was developed that included mandatory courses on child rights, designed to ensure that future generations of Burkina citizens would never again tolerate child exploitation. Students learned not just that child labor was wrong, but why education and childhood development were essential for personal and national prosperity. The economic impact of these changes was remarkable as well. As more children stayed in school, instead of working, adult employment increased. As families received support and education, their economic productivity improved dramatically. The investment in child protection and education was generating significant returns in terms of economic growth and social stability. International economists who studied the Burkina Faso model found that every dollar invested in rescuing and educating a child generated approximately $4 in long-term economic benefit to the country. 5 years after that fateful day at the construction site, President Traoré declared a national holiday, the Day of the Child. This annual celebration would honor all children and recommit the nation to protecting their rights and opportunities. The first day of the child celebration was held at the very dam where Adama had been found working. The construction project had been completed, and it now provided electricity to thousands of homes across the region. But more importantly, it had become a symbol of transformation, a place where exploitation had been replaced by hope. Adama, now 12 years old and an honor student, was invited to speak at the celebration. Thousands of people gathered to hear from the boy whose courage had changed their nation. 5 years ago, I stood in this same place carrying sand because I thought that was my destiny, Adama said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. I thought my life would always be about survival, about struggling just to make it through each day. But President Traoré showed me that every child deserves more than just survival. We deserve the chance to thrive, to learn, to dream, and to contribute to our country's greatness. He paused and looked directly at President Traoré, who was sitting in the front row with tears of pride in his eyes. Papa Ibrahim, Adama continued, using the affectionate name he had called the president. Since that first day, you didn't just save one boy. You saved an entire generation. Every child in Burkina Faso is safer, more hopeful, and has better opportunities because of your compassion and action. The crowd erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. President Traoré rose from his seat and embraced the remarkable young man that Adama had become. As President Ibrahim Traoré sat in his office that evening, reviewing reports on the continuing success of the child protection programs, his mind returned to that day at the dam when a small boy with dusty hands had broken through all the barriers of power and protocol to touch his heart. The statistics were impressive. Tens of thousands of children rescued from exploitative labor. Dramatic increases in school enrollment and graduation rates, significant reductions in child mortality and malnutrition, and measurable improvements in economic opportunities for families throughout the country. But beyond the numbers, there was something more profound that had changed in Burkina Faso. There was a renewed sense of national purpose, a shared commitment to protecting the most vulnerable, and a deep pride in being a country that truly cared for its children. Other African nations had begun implementing similar programs, sending delegations to study the Burkina Faso model and adapting its principles to their own contexts. The transformation that had begun with one boy's courage and one leader's compassion was spreading across the continent. Adama, now recognized as one of the most promising young scholars in West Africa, continued to excel academically while never forgetting his mission to help other children. He had been accepted into an accelerated program that would allow him to begin medical studies at age 16, putting him on track to become the doctor he had dreamed of becoming. But perhaps more importantly, he remained the same humble, caring boy who remembered what it felt like to carry burdens too heavy for small shoulders. His empathy and determination to help others had not diminished with his success. They had only grown stronger. The construction site where this story began had been transformed as well. In addition to the functioning hydroelectric dam, there was now a memorial garden dedicated to all the children of Burkina Faso, with a special plaque honoring Adama's courage and President Traoré's compassionate leadership. The plaque read simply, "On this site, a small boy's courage met a great leader's compassion, and together they changed a nation." May we never forget that the future of our country rests in how we treat our children today. As the sun set over Burkina Faso, millions of children went to sleep in safe homes, their school bags packed for another day of learning, their dreams filled with possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. And in a comfortable house not far from the presidential palace, a young scholar named Adama reviewed his homework by electric light, no longer the flickering candlelight of poverty, but the bright, steady illumination of hope, opportunity, and a future without limits. The boy who once carried sand now carried the dreams of an entire nation, and he carried them with the same determination that had once helped him survive, but now helped him thrive. This is more than just a story of rescue. It is a testament to the power of compassion, the importance of leadership that serves the vulnerable, and the incredible potential that lies within every child when given the opportunity to flourish. The transformation of one boy became the transformation of a nation, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of courage and the most compassionate responses to suffering can change the course of history. As President Ibrahim Traoré often said in his speeches, "We measure our success not by the wealth we accumulate, but by the children we save, the dreams we nurture, and the hope we create for future generations." In Burkina Faso, that measure of success had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations, one rescued child at a time. If you appreciate what our dear president has accomplished, please say a prayer for him and for all the children whose lives have been transformed by compassion, courage, and the unwavering belief that every child deserves a chance to reach their full potential.